Australians, First Nations 1788 to now. Overview: Aboriginal Australians are the world's oldest continuous culture, with over 65,000 years of deep connection to land, law, and spirituality. British colonisation in 1788 brought dispossession, disease, like smallpox, massacres, and cultural suppression. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, Aboriginal people were displaced, denied rights, and subjected to harsh policies, including the forced removal of children, stolen generations, and degrading treatment in prisons. Yet, they resisted and preserved culture. Major milestones include the 1967 referendum, the Mabo Decision 1992, recognising native title, and Kevin Rudd's 2008 apology. However, life expectancy remains up to 8 years lower than non-Indigenous Australians, and disparities in health, incarceration, and opportunity persist. The 2023 Voice referendum was defeated, highlighting ongoing divisions. Today, Aboriginal Australians continue to fight for justice, recognition, and a fair future, carrying forward a legacy of resilience and strength. Introduction. Aboriginal Australians are the world's oldest continuing culture, with histories on the continent stretching back at least 65,000 years. Their societies were rich in oral tradition, law, art, and land-based spirituality. This history, however, was profoundly disrupted beginning in 1788 with the arrival of British settlers. What followed was a story of dispossession, resistance, survival, and, in recent decades, a struggle for justice and recognition. References: Aboriginal Australians, Richard Broom 2019. The Australian Aborigines, A.P. Elkin 1948, a classic. Donald Thompson, D.T., In Arnhem Land, by Donald Thompson 2010. Stone Maps of Waterholes / Tracks. 1788 1850, Invasion and Frontier Violence. When the first fleet arrived at Sydney Cove in 1788, an estimated 300,000 to 1 million Aboriginal people were living across the continent in over 250 distinct language groups. The British declared Australia terra nullius, land belonging to no one, ignoring Aboriginal sovereignty. The local tribes were not happy to see the white arrivals in their red uniforms and sailboats with white sails. Little did they realise that within 18 months, nearly 80% of them would be dead from introduced smallpox disease. Some of the same officers who had introduced it via blankets in North America were on the same fleet. Ross and Campbell, see page 64-68. The Dust of Mindy, Jim Poulter, 2016. The local Aboriginal people knew they were in paradise. The bush was full of animals to hunt, the harbour was teeming with fish. So did Governor Phillip think the same way as the first fleet made its way up the harbour. Actually, Sydney siders still due to this day, but for the Aboriginal people this was not to last. Mother with her baby, shortly after birth, cord still attached and wrapped in bark. Pic from DT. Initial contact was marked by curiosity but quickly turned violent. As settlers expanded inland, conflict erupted. Frontier violence, including massacres, poisoned food, flour, and punitive raids, led to dramatic population decline. Introduced diseases like smallpox, influenza, and measles further decimated Aboriginal communities. Gathering corn, Pic DT. There are over 100,000 rock art galleries, from last 60,000 years, recording their history in graphic form, which is a high form of civilization, not dislike Egyptian hieroglyphics. 1850-1900, dispossession and cultural suppression. By the mid-19th century, most fertile lands were taken for agriculture and grazing. Aboriginal people were driven from their lands and forced onto missions, reserves, or into fringe camps. Government policies shifted from extermination to control. Christian missions sought to civilize Aboriginal Australians by erasing language, customs, and spirituality. Traditional law and social structures were suppressed, and hunting grounds lost. Aboriginal labour was exploited in rural industries, often unpaid. They were expert spear throwers, with a greater accuracy and range than the muskets of the settlers. Such spears are still used today on Gruutaland. Making spearhead, pick DT. The use of neck chains. One of the most harrowing practices at Roboangaul, Western Australia, was the use of iron neck chains on Aboriginal prisoners. These heavy restraints were employed during long marches from remote regions such as Kununurra, with prisoners often covering hundreds of kilometres on foot in extreme heat. Upon arrival, the chains were sometimes so heated that the padlocks had to be smashed off on a blacksmith's anvil to prevent further injury. Inside the gaol, prisoners were shackled by the neck and ankles to iron rings embedded in the walls, often with up to 40 individuals crammed into cells designed for 14. Despite growing public condemnation, the use of neck chains persisted well into the 20th century. A 1905 Royal Commission recommended replacing neck chains with handcuffs, but the practice was not officially phased out until the 1940s and continued informally in some areas until the 1960s. Aboriginal Australians used advanced traditional methods to treat wounds, combining natural materials with cultural knowledge. Wound clips, made from plant spines, fish bones, or animal bones, held together with sinew or plant fibre to close wounds, functioning like modern staples. Stone knives, sharp blades made from flaked stone, for example quartz, used for surgical cuts, lancing abscesses, and ritual scarification. These techniques reflect a deep understanding of anatomy, hygiene, and healing, developed long before modern surgical tools. Dennis Considine, a surgeon on the First Fleet, was so impressed with their use of eucalyptus oil for healing that he recommended back in Ireland and Europe. 1901–1967, Segregation and the Stolen Generations. With Federation in 1901, Aboriginal Australians were excluded from the new constitution. They could not vote federally, were not counted in the census, and were subject to state-based protection acts. These laws tightly controlled movement, employment, marriage, and residency. From Aboriginal Australians, p. 315. One of the darkest legacies of this era was the forced removal of Aboriginal children, known as the Stolen Generations. Government officials and missionaries took children from their families to be raised in white institutions or fostered into white homes. The policy aimed to breed out Aboriginal identity. Thought to be protecting children from hardship, it was done in a cruel and heartless governmental way as children were grabbed from their loving parents. Daisy Bates, 1859–1951, was an Irish-born Australian ethnographer best known for her work with Aboriginal communities in the early 20th century. She spent decades living in remote camps across Western and South Australia, documenting Aboriginal languages, customs, and kinship systems. Eccentric and controversial, she often wore Edwardian clothing in the desert and referred to herself as the protector of Aborigines. Though she preserved valuable cultural records, her work is now criticised for its paternalism, racial assumptions, and inaccuracies. Her legacy remains a mix of dedication, myth-making, and colonial bias. She wrote a book, The Passing of the Aborigines, which alluded to infanticide/cannibalism. Despite repression, Aboriginal resistance endured, through petitions, community organisation, and cultural preservation. Leaders such as William Cooper and Jack Patton began to publicly protest for rights and recognition. 1967–1992, rights movements and legal shifts. The 1967 referendum marked a turning point. Over 90% of Australians voted to allow the federal government to make laws for Aboriginal people and include them in the census. This symbolic victory catalysed political activism. In 1972, the Aboriginal Tent Embassy was established outside Parliament House, demanding land rights and sovereignty. Land rights legislation followed, notably the Aboriginal Land Rights (NT) Act 1976. The 1980s saw increased self-determination policies, the foundation of Aboriginal-controlled health and legal services, and the growth of cultural pride. But what is required is down-to-earth practical health solutions as provided by eye-surgeon, Dr. Fred Hollows, who in the 1980s 1929-1993 visited numerous isolated communities treating eye conditions. Other approaches would be a requirement that our medical students and young graduates spend a term in such communities. Provide tiny houses, which can be bought cheaply on Amazon or Temu, self-contained, and place in such communities. Many still live in squalid homes. Breastplates, gorgets, were worn as a sense of honour. Allow access to the many trusts which tie up / limit access to mining royalties. How many Aboriginal people have you seen driving around in Rolls-Royces in Sydney or Melbourne? In 1992, the High Court of Australia overturned terra nullius in the Mabo v Queensland decision, legally recognising native title for the first time. This was a landmark moment, acknowledging the enduring connection between Aboriginal peoples and their lands. 1993-2008, Reconciliation and Recognition. Following Mabo, the Native Title Act 1993 provided a legal framework for claiming land. However, it proved complex and often favoured pastoral and mining interests. In 1997, the Bringing Them Home report detailed the trauma of the stolen generations, sparking a national push for apology and healing. Yet, successive governments refused to apologise, until Prime Minister Kevin Rudd formally apologised on the 13th of February, 2008. This apology was a powerful act of national reconciliation, though critics noted that it did not come with compensation or structural reform. Dr. Colin Mackenzie, 1877-1938, orthopaedic surgeon, put together a vast collection of artefacts, which form the basis of our National Museum in Canberra. 2009-2023, Health Gaps, Incarceration, and the Voice Debate. Despite formal recognition and apology, profound inequalities persisted. Aboriginal Australians have a life expectancy up to 8 years shorter than non-Indigenous Australians. Rates of incarceration, suicide, child removal, and chronic disease remain disproportionately high. The Closing the Gap framework, introduced in 2008, aimed to reduce these disparities but has seen only limited success. Calls for deeper constitutional recognition grew, culminating in the 2017 Uluru Statement from the Heart, which proposed a First Nations voice to Parliament enshrined in the Constitution. In 2023, a national referendum on the voice was held, but the proposal was defeated. The rejection caused widespread hurt among Aboriginal communities and highlighted deep national divisions about identity, history, and reconciliation. 2024 now, a nation at a crossroads. Today, Aboriginal Australians continue to assert their rights, preserve culture, and fight for justice. Language revival, cultural heritage protection, and community-led health and education initiatives are ongoing. Younger generations are leading movements for decolonisation, truth-telling, and environmental stewardship. At the same time, debates about land rights, treaty-making, and constitutional reform remain unresolved. Australia faces a moral and political challenge to truly reconcile its past with its present, and to walk together with its first peoples in truth and justice. History of note. Donald Thomson DT, 1901–1970, was an Australian anthropologist who formed the Special Reconnaissance Unit, SRU, during World War II to defend Northern Australia, specifically Arnhem Land and the Arafura Coast, against Japanese invasion. The SRU was composed mainly of Yolngu Aboriginal men, armed not with guns but with spears, woomera, and traditional weapons. Thomson believed their deep knowledge of the land and silent combat techniques made them ideal for guerrilla-style reconnaissance and ambush. Though never formally enlisted or equally paid, their efforts were crucial in defending remote coastlines. The SRU is now recognized as a pioneering example of Indigenous military contribution. Preparing for Japanese invasion. Pick of DT. Conclusion. The history of Aboriginal Australians from 1788 to now is not a single story of victimhood, but a tense instrument to survival, adaptation, and resistance. Despite over 2 centuries of dispossession and trauma, Aboriginal cultures endure. The path forward depends on national honesty, respectful partnership, and enduring commitment to equality and justice. As of 2025, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander representation in professional fields is growing but still below parity. Progress is being made, but more support is needed to reach equality. As of 2025, doctors, there are about 850 Indigenous doctors in Australia, 0.5% of all doctors, 473 in training. Lawyers, 757 Indigenous solicitors, 0.8% of all, highest proportions in NT and QLD. The Australian Federal Parliament includes 11 Indigenous members, 2 in the House of Representatives and 9 in the Senate, marking a significant milestone in political representation. But the truth remains that the sense of foreboding they felt in 1788 was right. Their nation was about to be and has been devastated. Their population has not really recovered. But they will survive despite, when crazy Western nations have destroyed the planet with nuclear war, only these people will be still able to find water and food in the resulting desert. To their great credit, the following anthropologists and medical doctors are closely involved in such communities. Anthropologists and researchers. Amy Roberts, archaeologist working with traditional owners in South Australia. Nicholas Smith, expert in native title and cultural heritage in WA. Sarah Holcomb works on Indigenous governance and land rights. Diane Smith focuses on identity, leadership, and governance. Sally Kate May collaborates on Aboriginal rock art and museum projects. Marsha Langton, leading scholar on Indigenous land, art, and policy. Julie Andrews, Aboriginal academic advancing First Nations research. Kathleen Clapham, researcher in Aboriginal health and well-being. Small Blue Diamond, medical doctors and health experts. Sandra Eads, first Aboriginal woman with a PhD in medicine, leads child health research. Asha Bowen, specialist in skin infections and rheumatic heart disease. Jonathan Karapetis focuses on Indigenous child health and infectious disease. Helen Milroy, Australia's first Indigenous doctor, works in child and adolescent psychiatry. Wendy Hoy researches chronic disease and kidney health in Indigenous populations. Lisa Jackson Pulver, public health leader focused on cancer and Indigenous well-being. Chrissia Tapia designs culturally safe health programs. Carly James, Aboriginal GP serving remote communities. Fiona Stanley promotes Indigenous-led public health initiatives and birthing programs. These professionals are improving Aboriginal well-being through community-led, culturally safe, and evidence-based work across anthropology, archaeology, health, and social policy.